Hi everybody. Why you should live abroad. Now, that's quite a statement, and it implies that perhaps by the end of this presentation I'll try to have you convinced to live abroad. But instead of lecturing you sort of on the empirical merits of doing so, I'm going to talk about my experiences of living abroad and of growing up in several different European countries. And I think living abroad is something everybody should try. And hopefully you'll at least consider doing the same by the end of this presentation. So this talk is something that's deeply personal to me, and that's growing up abroad. And I think everybody here will be able to relate to this, at least some extent, because I'm wondering how many of you here were born in Belgium? Can you raise your hands? Wow, okay, that's a lot of people. Nice. How many of you have lived in more than one country? Okay, more than 2 countries? Okay, so quite an international audience. And I'm also quite like you. I've also lived in, well, more than 2 countries. I've lived in Slovakia, then Ireland for almost a decade. Belgium, I went to this very school. I sat in those seats. And now I live in Sweden, where I'm studying at university. And I'm extremely fortunate for these experiences. And these have been fantastic. And I've been able to compare these experiences to one another. And basically, I have friends all over Europe and all over the world now. So I'm extremely fortunate for that. But it's also important for me to note that these experiences have been an experience of privilege. Not everybody has the same opportunity as me to live up abroad and grow up abroad. And nevertheless, though, this is something that's marked my development, my worldviews, and my understanding of how people behave across countries. And I've learned a few things, but one of the things that I've learned is that nobody in their right mind, for example, would move to Scandinavia for the cuisine, and fries are Belgian, not French, and anybody claiming otherwise is deeply, deeply mistaken. But moving on to more about me and less about cuisine. So this talk was an opportunity for a lot of introspection, because for many years my place in the world felt a bit flou. Those of you speaking French would know that that means sort of uncertain, vague, blurry, sort of constantly shifting. And I found it hard to pinpoint, hard to define, and words like identity and home were words I preferred to avoid rather than confront head-on. Whenever somebody would ask me which country's culture I preferred most or what place I called home, I would be like, oh, well, it depends. It's complicated, I would say. I mean, questions such as, where are you from and what do you study are probably the 2 most frequent questions anybody asks you at university, especially if you're an international student. And they are simple questions, but even a question as simple as, where are you from, for me, elicits an uncertain response. Because I am Slovak, my nationality is Slovak, I was born in Slovakia. My parents are Slovak, my grandparents are Slovak. And, well, I am Slovak, technically. And technically, because I've only spent 1/4 of my life there, I've only spent my childhood there, my early childhood years, and therefore my memories of growing up in this country are quite few and far between. People like me are called third culture kids, and there's a handy book about third culture kids, which will show up on the slides behind me once they show up. This is a there we go, perfect. This is a book written by David Pollock, Ruth Van Recken, and Michael Pollock about people like me. And they also define these third culture kids, if we go to the next slide. And then that's basically people that have grown up as me, and they define it. Can we get the definition? Perfect. Super. Sorry about that. Now, a third culture kid is a person who spends a significant part of his or her first 18 years of life accompanying parents into a country or countries that are different from at least one parent's passport countries due to a parent's choice of work or advanced training. Now, that's quite a wordy definition, and I've broken it apart for you just so that it's sort of easier to read. And essentially, it's young people that have spent a good chunk of their childhood in a country different to the country they were born in. So that's a lot of people like you and me. And the reason why they've worded this definition in the way they have is because they're trying to achieve two aims, this book authors. Basically, they're saying they're trying to make the definition as broad as possible to include the greatest number of people as possible, but they're also trying to give some boundaries to this definition. And for example, just so that it's maybe easier to imagine, somebody that's a 5-year-old that moved to Spain because of one of their parents' jobs and stayed in Spain until they were 18, they would be a third culture kid. Third culture kids are also, there's an important distinction to make, which is that third culture kids, so me, for example, we expect repatriation, and that's what the authors call it, but it basically means that you expect to go home, wherever home may be. And this is different from immigrants, for example, who expect to permanently settle in a specific country. Later, the authors added the concept of cross-cultural kids, and I'm also going to show you the definition here. And this is a broader definition than the third culture kids, and it's basically a person that has lived, who is living or has lived in or meaningfully interacted with 2 or more cultural environments in the first 18 years of life. There you go. And this definition is broader because it includes cultural environments, and it doesn't focus only on countries, so differing from the previous definition, because, for example, this can include people that are moving within a different country into different regions in that country. And these definitions have sort of evolved over time, over the last 4 or so decades while they've existed, because now it's a lot more common for people like you and me to move abroad and to grow up abroad. In the past, this used to be reserved for basically only families of diplomatic and military personnel. There's a few things the authors mention in their book, and that's that TCKs, like me, try to build relationships with all the cultures they've lived in, but they don't have what they call full ownership of any. And that basically means that we find it easier to relate to people that have also grown up all over the place. And that makes sense, right? I find it easier to relate to somebody like you that's lived in 3 different countries than somebody from a small Swedish fishing village. And they also mention a few benefits of living abroad and also some drawbacks, and I'll talk about the benefits first. They mention international mobility, exposure to different cultures and languages, expanded worldview, and cross-cultural enrichment, just to name a few. And as drawbacks, they mention sort of having to say goodbye all the time, identity questions, confused loyalties to the home country, ignorance of the home culture, and rootlessness and restlessness as the drawbacks. And by restlessness, they mean sort of somebody that has trouble settling down in a place. I mean, when you're moving around a lot, it's sort of easy to keep moving around a lot. And of course, all of these things depend on how long the duration of the stay has been and if the person qualifies as a third culture kid. But I'm not here today to give you a deep insight into the academic debate and the evolution of the different definitions of the last 4 decades. But instead, I've just given you a brief insight into this book and this topic. And if you're interested in this field further, I really encourage you to read books like these because they are quite enlightening. So back to about me. For many years, I felt quite lost in the world. And I'm aware that sounds ridiculously cliche, but it's also true. And it took me until this talk to actually sit down and think about my experiences and feelings about growing up abroad. For example, when you first go to uni, one of the first things you learn is just how painfully ignorant you are of everything, how many things you don't know. And for me, it was the first place that I realized that I don't know what I don't know. There were so many things to discover. And there is one thing that I do know in my life, despite not knowing most things. And that thing that I do know is that there's been a constant in my life, and this constant has been, perhaps paradoxically, has been change, and change of where I'm living. Moving from one country to another country has been deeply exciting and rewarding and really, really fun. But growing up in such flux has problems and repercussions in addition to the benefits it carries, for sure. And what I'm trying to say in a perhaps meandering way is this, that it's good to think about your upbringing, your past, and a little introspection, looking inside, can help. But it's even better to find other people with similar experiences and talk to them and read about them, going through the same thing. And it's okay if you feel like your place in the world is a little bit lost. It's okay if you feel like it's a bit of a big question mark. It's okay if you feel lost and confused. Time will give you perspective. And I deeply, deeply believe this. That being said, though, I still think living abroad is something everybody should try, if you haven't done it already. And whether that's for study, for work, or for a long-term change of scenery, I believe that the benefits far, far outweigh the downsides. For instance, you get to experience so many more different cultures by living abroad. You get to have a broader worldview, and it breaks down prejudice you might have had before. Let me give you an example. It's very common for all of us, I was also one of these people, to routinely romanticize Scandinavia for being basically the pinnacle of human achievement in terms of, well, most things, really. And perhaps justifiably so. I mean, Scandinavian countries routinely make it to the very top of most human development indicators. But living in Sweden has also laid bare the cracks in Swedish society. For example, has shown to me Swedes' obsession for queuing to random places, or their deep passion for organized activities, or perhaps the actual true cracks of society and the tensions between different groups within Swedish society. Despite that, though, it's still an amazing place to live, and I would like to continue living there after my studies. But what I'm trying to say by this little anecdote is this, that it's by living abroad, you get to experience the world yourself rather than through the media or through public discourse. You get to make up your own mind instead of feeding off somebody else's experiences. You get to meet and become friends with locals, and you get to discover what makes them tick, what hobbies they have, what they do for fun, what they eat, what they drink. And as I said, moved to Sweden because of the furniture, the landscape, maybe even the high incomes, but don't move there because of the fermented fish. And lastly, just to wrap things up, I think this talk would benefit from a reframing. There behind me is the new title of this talk, or perhaps the title of this talk, what it should have been. I think it should be why you should reflect about living abroad. Because those of you who've already lived abroad can think about, okay, what did this experience give me? What did the people I get to know, what are the things that I've learned to love and cherish? And those of you who've yet to live abroad, consider doing so. Consider doing so. And I deeply mean it. Because you get to experience all those things I said, despite the potential drawbacks. And I started off this talk by talking about my experiences. And perhaps a question you might be asking is, but would I like to experience these again? And the answer is absolutely yes, 100%, definitely. And I think you should have the opportunity to make experiences like that of your own. Thank you.